Let's hurry up and grab our seats here so we can get started. I see some old soldiers trying to limp their way in here and get sympathy on the way up. Old paratroopers do that. I've almost recovered from my back surgery, by the way. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 2010 Land Warfare Contemporary Military Forum Series. This is the 17th year that we've been doing these sorts of things as a part of the AUSA annual meeting. Our goal is to give the meeting the attendees the opportunity to listen to and ask questions of those who are in fact making the decisions, well, not necessarily making the decisions, making the papers up to send to the decision makers as to important subjects that are going on in the future. This is one of 13 forums that's going to be conducted over the next 3 days. This year we're going to address various topics of transformation and readiness and the issues related to national defense. You wouldn't expect us to do much else. We are confident we're going to lead to your active participation, and you ought to think about the questions that you want to ask this team of experts that are up here, because that's what we are. We have a very unusual team that we put together here. And the topic that we have is the Army readiness, maintaining our combat edge today and for tomorrow. And Lieutenant General Dan Bolger, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff for G3, 5, and 7. I used to be a desk ops a long time ago, and I'm reminded of that, which also had the G8 as a part of that, is going to be our panel leader. And General Bolger, I'll go ahead and turn that over to you. But thank you very much for the team you put together here. I'll be sitting in the front row with my coffee.
Great. Thank you, sir. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time out to come to our panel. As General Foss mentioned, I'm the Army staff lead for operations, plans, training, and force management. And with me, I've got really the experts on Army readiness in terms of staff leadership throughout the service. So myself, obviously, I mentioned G3. I'd like to briefly let each of the panel members introduce themselves and tell you what their current position is. And then we'll each give some introductory remarks, then open it up for discussion.
Hi, sir. Thanks. I'm Major General Mark Graham. I'm the Force Com G357.
Hi, I'm Brigadier General John Miller. I'm the Deputy Commanding General of the United States Army Reserve Command.
And I'm Brigadier General Tim Cadby, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Army National Guard.
All right. So represented up here, we've got all three components that make up our total Army: the active, the Guard, and the Reserve. And then what I wanted to do is just frame the picture of how we look at Army readiness today, so you can get an idea of why the Army does things the way it does right now. And then we'll talk about some of the challenges affiliated with that, because like most things in the service, it's a work in progress. The Army as it exists today is different than the Army you would have seen if we gathered 10 years ago in October of the year 2000, before the terrorist attacks on our country on the 11th of September 2001. The Army that exists now is a result of strategic decisions that were made shortly after those terrorist attacks. And I'm going to go through those three decisions, each of one which was very consequential, and then sort of tell you where we're at now in terms of carrying those decisions out. The three strategic decisions that affected the Army that occurred after 9/11 were these. The first, and I believe of the three, probably the most important, was the early decision by the President and the senior leadership, with the approval of our United States Congress representing the people of the United States, to activate the reserve components, in the case of the Army, our Guard and our Reserve, for the duration of the conflict. And that is an extremely significant act for multiple reasons. One point I'd mention is that the Constitution gives the authority to the President to call on at that time of the militia, now the Guard and the Reserve components. But it gives the Congress the requirement to provide rules for good order and discipline and to provide funding. And both of those things were carried out and continue to be carried out. Today, as we speak, we're in partial mobilization, and it's essentially ratified every year by an act of Congress where the authorization and the appropriations are passed to carry out that mobilization. And the effect that this has had on our military is it ensured the support and the commitment of the entire country. Because when you commit the Army National Guard, the Army Reserve, and all the other services reserves, and of course the Air has a Guard as well, when you commit that, you've committed people from all over the United States, from every state and territory, from every city and small town. And an interesting phenomenon occurs. The folks who do polling for a living will tell you that the wars, the major fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, it sometimes has been very popular, sometimes very unpopular. It varies a lot. But the one thing that does not vary is that in general, people in the United States have chosen to support their military throughout this conflict. And I believe that's a direct consequence of that initial decision by the President of the United States to request partial mobilization and then to have that funded by our Congress to represent the citizens. Just an aside that's worth noting, the last time we had this degree of mobilization during a major conflict was in the Korean War. And it's of interest to me, at least, that the President of the United States during the Korean War was Harry Truman, a former member of the Army National Guard in World War I, a former member of the Army Reserve up through World War II, who made that decision. President Bush was a former member of the Air Guard. And it's interesting that those presidents chose to do it. There's men and women present in this room today who know that that decision was not made during the Vietnam War for a variety of reasons. And what it tends to do when you don't mobilize reserve in a strategic decision up front is it tends to disengage the bulk of the American people, and over time it can cost you the support of the people. Today we still have that popular support, and I think that's a direct consequence. And the effect on our reserve component has been significant because rather than be used as a strategic backstop as occurred through most of the Cold War, the Army Guard and the Army Reserve are very much operational elements. Today as we gather, we have about 80,000 guardsmen and reservists on active duty right now, many of whom are serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we could not function without them in the fight. I should also mention that this strategic decision underscored the wisdom of Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, General Creighton Abrams, and others after the Vietnam War when they consciously designed the American military so that in order to fight anything but the most limited operations, you had to mobilize the Guard and Reserve. And a very, very consequential act. And that for Army readiness now gives us the challenge that we have to complete the operationalization of our Guard and Reserve, and we'll talk more about that in the discussion. The second strategic decision that was made shortly after the attacks on the 11th of September 2001 was the decision that soldiers would go into the fight by unit rotation. As you know, there's a couple different models you can use to send a force to fight. General Barron's good to see you, by the way, and who knows this very well from the tradition of the British Army. Forces that have operated long around the world outside from home realize that although it is not the most efficient, in other words, the bean counters and the accountants don't like it, sending folks by units preserves unit cohesion and a connection back to the home station that is very, very important in a long conflict. And it's very important also in long peacetime engagement. The British Army has a long tradition of this, and we looked at their model when this decision was made. In addition, our own Army had experience with both individual rotations in parts of Korea and Vietnam in the Cold War and latter parts of World War II, and unit rotations in each of those wars. And we knew that you could do both. And that, again, efficiency-wise, the easiest thing to do is leave the flag and fill in individuals. But effectiveness-wise and cohesion, discipline, and morale in the long term, it is best to rotate units. We had experimented with that in the Sinai mission that began in 1982, where we've always rotated battalions through that mission. And then when we went into the Balkans, we also sent units as unit types, and they came in and went as units. I might add that most of our NATO allies, led by the British, were doing the same. And so with that in our background, an early decision was made to go with unit rotation. That was a pretty good decision early on after 9/11 when you were talking in terms of 1 or 2 brigades committed in Afghanistan. Once we became committed in Iraq and the numbers began to climb, we realized we'd have to look very carefully at our Army structure. And the decision to go with unit rotation then caused us to relook our structure and shift completely from what used to be a divisional-based structure to the current modular brigade-based structure. And a little bit more on that when I mention our third strategic choice. So the second strategic choice, unit rotation, was very, very important. And like the support that the Guard and Reserve generate in small town and cities of America, I believe unit rotation is what has allowed our force to have a high degree of resilience as we go into this fight. And again, experience of the British Army, the French Army, the German Army, and others would tell you, as our Army learned also in previous wars, that is a very effective solution, although not always the most cost effective. It is expensive in money, it's expensive in time, and you do duplicate a lot of headquarters. But on the other hand, your Army can stay in the field for a long, long time. The third choice was actually a non-choice, but I need to mention it because it was extremely important, especially in light of the first two. And that was, in the aftermath of the attacks on the 11th of September, the national leadership, ratified by the U.S. Congress, supported by the U.S. people, and this support remains as ratified annually in budgets and authorization documents, elected to fight this war on a relatively fixed end strength for the military. Now, the Army has expanded. The active force was about 485,000 on 9/11 and has expanded up to about 569,000 to include our temporary end strength increase we've been permitted. But when you really look at that, that is not a very large increase. By World War II, Korea, or Vietnam standards, it's a small increase in the size of the force. Just by comparison, the force that we fielded during the first Gulf War, after mobilizations were complete, actually topped out at over 1 million soldiers during that fighting in 1990 and 91. For this one, the average amount of soldiers on active duty from all components has run about 700,000 on the average day. It's been a little higher or a little lower. Right now it's about 680, plus or minus a few thousand. But that has been the number, and I mention that because that decision to go with a fixed end strength then presented the Army with the challenge of how do you reorganize your forces. And that's what led to the modularity that was carried out in the midst of this war. Essentially, the Army is basically, in many ways, the same size as it's always been since we started the war. Again, we've had some increase, about 10 to 15%. But the units essentially reorganized themselves to gain more combat power out of that capability. And that was done at cost. Some of the combat support and combat service support that used to be in uniform is now made up by a contract force. And I know several of you in here are involved in contract operations, and everybody in here has worked with contractors as part of the current war. And there's all kinds of rules of thumb on contractors, but I would tell you that in general, the rule is in the initial phases of fighting, there's always some contractors, but not a great number. But once you settle down, as you have in theaters like Afghanistan and Iraq, and in the supporting areas such as Kuwait, the general rule is you have about one contractor for every person in uniform. And that reflects that decision to go with a fixed end strength. So as I mentioned, great support from the American people, unit rotation to provide us the capability to field trained, ready, and high morale forces time after time into this fight, and then maintaining a fixed end strength. But there's a great deal of expense involved because you have the contractors, and I would mention that. Now, what this led to for the Army as we modularized our force and reorganized, we realized we were going to have to send this force in on a rotating basis. So one of the comments you'll always hear American military talk about, not just soldiers, but you'll hear this in the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, is they'll refer to bog dwell. And I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, for our soldiers pretty much, but definitely for their families, that is the one set of numbers they're very, very aware of. And what bog dwell boils down to is bog, boots on the ground, is how much time you're over in the fight, and dwell is how much time between rotations. Up until this time in the war, and if you think about it now, we've been engaged since the 11th of September 2001, and the Iraq campaign started in March of '03. But over this decade that's gone by, our dwell has generally been about equal to our boots on the ground. In other words, we've been fairly close to 1-to-1, especially after the 1st of March 2003 in rotating units. Our reserve components have done a little better, but I don't want to paint a rosy picture, because in the case of reserve components, in many cases, the units may be on a bog dwell of 1-to-3, but many of the individuals have volunteered to go in an individual format or as roundouts to other units that are deploying. So right now, this is one of our particular challenges. And one of the things that we believe is going to happen as we complete our withdrawal of forces from Iraq is that we'll have the ability to get our active component to about 1 year in the fight for every 2 years at home, and get our reserve component for about 1 year in the fight to every 4 years at home. We are not there yet. And you'll hear General Casey, I know he and the Secretary of the Army will refer to bog dwell in their comments to this convention. But it is very, very important that we get that, because right now, ladies and gentlemen, at least in my view, if we were to continue on this 1-to-1 or 1 to 1.3 or whatever for the AC and 1 to 2 or 1 to 2.5 for the RC, that is not a sustainable rate. And I don't have to tell anyone here that if you look at the evidence, and it's more than anecdotal in terms of family issues, criminal issues, drug and substance abuse, suicide rates and such, those are indicators of a challenge of a force that's stressed when you're trying to carry out these rotations within a fixed end strength. So we have got to get our bog and dwell straight. And I would tell you that as we look at that, and this will be a subject I think for the discussion, there's a couple things that have to happen for that to occur. The first is we got to maintain the end strength we've got. I told you it was fixed, but it would be very, very difficult for us if we had a major reduction in end strength of any of our components. So we need the guardsmen we have, the reservists, and the active component soldiers we have at about the numbers we've got them. You start taking major chunks out of that and continue the amount of rotation we got right now, you will not reach those sustainable rates of rotation. The second thing that we need besides that is access to the reserve components. And the gentlemen here, Tim and John, when they speak, will talk about the critical role that's been played by our Guard and Army Reserve in the current war and in the defense of the homeland. And I will tell you this, that access, again, over this long period has been very, very critical to the war effort, but it is not guaranteed. It takes an annual renewal by the President, and it also takes an act of Congress to fund it. And both of those things are subject to the will of the American people. And again, the American people can make a different election at any one time, literally through electoral results and also through their interaction with their representatives. And then the final point that I would make is that for this military to be capable, it has to be funded. Now, right now, our military gets about $250 billion a year, and that's a lot of money. But I would tell you that as much money as that is, and that is a significant amount compared to what we started the war with, as much money as that is, we use every bit of it, because I mentioned we have about half of our force that actually keeps us in the field, our contractors. And I might add that the forces that's in the field is modernizing constantly to stay ahead of the threat. So when you decide to do things like field 16,000 mine resistance ambush protected vehicles to a force, that has a trail of cost behind that. I mean, essentially, we have fielded the equivalent of a completely new combat system in the middle of the war. We have upgraded all of our major aircraft and combat vehicles, and every one of those has a cost. And I might add, because you don't have the green-suited soldiers to do all the work in it, they come with a contract tail as well. And these things lead to this higher cost. I might add the other thing, which we should never take for granted, and that is if you want quality soldiers and you want them to join your force and stay in your force, you have to pay for them. Right now in the United States of America, of about 10 18-year-olds that would line up in front of a recruiting station, only 3 of them will meet the qualifications to join the United States military. And those qualifications would include a high school diploma, a clean criminal record, physical health to include no use of drugs and alcohol. And those matters when you look at it. Now, over time, some of those other folks will also become eligible. But the point is, we're fighting for a very small cadre of folks that are very high end, and that's the same group that every college in America is looking for, every good firm is looking for, every good police force and municipal agency is looking for. And so for us, things like the GI Bill, things like affordable health care for our soldiers also become readiness issues, because that's what allows us to maintain this force. Because you'll see a lot of folks who will pull out the budget and say, well, you're spending all this money on personnel, to which I would respond, the readiness of the Army is the people in the Army. You know, the old Creighton Abrams statement, you know, people aren't in the Army, people are the Army. And our quality Army is dependent on these quality people. So it is indeed a readiness issue that health care is provided. And I might add, the young soldiers keep their eyes open. You know, they're well trained and smart. And they see how we treat retirees. They see how we treat soldiers who were wounded or who were sick. They see how we do all that. And we cannot break faith with those folks, because if we do, we will see the results in our recruiting and retention. So I want to leave you with that thought before I turn over here to my colleagues. And again, they'll have some introductory comments, probably not as long as mine, and then we'll have some discussion. Mark?
Well, thanks, sir. Well, good afternoon. We, as I said, at Forces Command, we do R4Gen, and that's what we'll spend some time on talking today is R4Gen and ForceCom's role in that process and the model we use. So I'll go through some things. I'll talk to you about our ForceCom's role, Then I'll talk to you about a couple lessons learned we've had over using R4Gen for the last several years. And then I'll talk about some ways ahead for R4Gen for our Army. First off, FORSCOM is the collective training lead for the United States Army, per the Chief of Staff. And Army Force Generation is not just a model, but it is the process in which we use to produce collective progressive readiness for our Army. We are part of the global force management process. So we work with Joint Forces Command to the Joint Staff to provide forces, trained and ready collective forces for the warfight or for any other mission we're given. So oftentimes when you hear the word demand, translate that word to requirements. We provide forces for validated requirements, whether they're combat requirements or non-combat requirements, just could be training missions. And we do that through a process that I'll discuss in a few minutes. But the global force management process is key to Forces Command and Army Force Generation, is the Army's part and process of how we do global force management. And we do this through R4Gen. We do this with pools. We have 3 pools, and some of you are very familiar with this, some of you may not be, so I'll go through a couple of the basics to make sure we're on the same glide path here. We have 3 pools in the Army. You're either a reset unit, you're a unit that's in train ready, or you're a unit that's available. One of the 3. Every unit is in one of those pools. And part of our discussion today can talk about how do we make sure that strategically we tell our soldiers and leaders what pool you're in and what that means to you. And we'll talk about that more. Every unit is in a pool, and every unit is one of 2 types. You're either a DEF unit, a deployment expeditionary force, or you're a CEF unit, a contingency expeditionary force. Key that there's a word in both descriptors that's the same, and that's expeditionary. So we are an expeditionary Army. So every unit is in a pool, and every unit is one of 2 types. You're a DEF unit, deployable expeditionary force, or a contingency expeditionary force. The difference between the 2 is this: a deployment expeditionary force has a latest arrival date to a named theater of operation. OND, OEF are 2 examples. The Army has given us a mission, and that is in the available year for that available pool. So every year we have to have a certain amount of forces. We call it a force package. The General Bolger tells us every year, FORSCOM, you got to provide this. 1 corps, 5 divisions, 20 brigade combat teams of different kinds, and 90,000 enabling forces. That could be aviation, fires, MPs, engineers, and the logisticians, and on, signal and everything else. So every year we've got to provide 1 corps, 5 divisions, 20 brigades, and 90,000 enablers. You will hear us refer to this as 1-5-20-90. Rolls right off your tongue. That's in the available year, every year. So I'd ask you to think of this 1-5-20-90 not as a package in itself, but as a conveyor belt. If you've gone to an airport lately, you've probably walked on a moving sidewalk. At any time we stop the sidewalk, there's 1 corps, 5 divisions, 20 brigades, and 90,000 enabling forces on the sidewalk. But once the sidewalk keeps moving like it does every day, units come on and off that conveyor belt all the time. That's R4Gen. Units are always moving through the process. We also have a requirement to provide a surge capability if called upon by the nation. And the surge force is in the train ready pool. These are the next available forces. And remember, at FORSCOM we do 3 things: man, train, and equip forces. The Title 10 functions for the Army. And we synchronize these capabilities to provide training ready forces. So you've got the available pool, which has 1-5-20-90. Then you've got a surge force, and the surge force is 1-4-10-41. 1-4-10-41. The surge force, because it's going to be required quickly, is predominantly an active component. Some of the enablers might be reserve, but the reserve component plays a huge part in the available pool on the 1-5-20-90. And we'll talk about that, and my colleagues will talk about that in even more detail. So how do we synchronize all this effort? We have three key processes that we use to synchronize this, because this is not self-synchronizing. It's worked on the installations, and then it's synchronized at Forces Command. And it's an interesting process. There's two models we have. One's called the TSRC, the Training Readiness Support Conference. So I'm sorry, the Training Support Readiness Conference, and then the other is the RSRC, the Resource Support Readiness Conference. These two processes allow us to talk to units before they deploy or before they go on a mission, and it also allows us to synchronize their efforts while they're gone and when they get back. So the whole process from when you find out what your next mission is in 3 years until you come back and start the recess process again, these two processes are used to track your units. And we do this by brigade. So brigades are connected. So these two processes are key. We then take the outputs of these two processes and we do something called the ARFORGEN Synchronization Board. And the ARFORGEN Synchronization Board produces an ARFORGEN synchronization laydown to the Army. And then General Bolger and his team produce an order, because we're an Army and we do things by an order. And they produce an ARFORGEN synchronization order. So very quickly, what I've laid out to you is Army Force Generation. It can be made as complex as you want or as simple as you want. And that's part of our challenge, is how do